So, fair warning, in this video I'm going to be talking about an impactful moment from Ruth Ozeki's A Tale for the Time Being. And to do that, I'll naturally be talking about the plot as a whole too. So if you have any plans on reading A Tale for the Time Being, and I would recommend it, then come back to this video later. Or don't, but beware of spoilers ahead. Now that's out of the way, let's talk about this book and this impactful moment. The first thing I want to do is introduce you to three very important characters: Ruth, Now, and the reader. The reader isn't actually a character, the reader's just you, or me, or whoever's reading the book, but they're important here because of the layering of different narratives. Okay, maybe not important for this moment specifically, but it's still a cool addition. Anyway, the story begins with the opening chapters of this diary, written by a 16-year-old Japanese schoolgirl called Now, who grew up in the USA. She's clearly having some issues in her life that she's at least somewhat reluctant to get into, and she talks rather ominously about the certainty of her imminent death, suggesting that she plans to commit suicide. And then we get a narrative from the perspective of someone else, an author called Ruth, who lives on a relatively small island in British Columbia, who discovers a lunchbox that's washed up on the beach. Inside this lunchbox, among other things, is this diary that we've read the first couple of chapters of. After an introduction to Ruth and Her World, we go back to Now's diary, and then back to Ruth, and from then onwards we're essentially reading Now's diary along with Ruth. When we come from a chapter about Now's diary onto a Ruth chapter, she's just read up to where we've just read up to in the diary. Which is actually really cool. It adds an extra emotional layer to Now's diary as Ruth reacts to what we've just read, often in a similar way. But for Ruth, this is an actual diary from an actual person, so she becomes obsessed with finding out as much as she can about Now and the people in her life. In Now's story, she is visited by her great-grandmother Jiko, a very old Buddhist monk who offers to take care of Now at her temple over the summer holidays. Initially, Now doesn't really want to go, and the reasons for this are slightly complex, so I won't go into all of them now because it's not too relevant to what I'm talking about here. But part of it, of course, is just the general reclusive teenage reluctance to go too far out of her comfort zone. But earlier on in the diary, before Jiko shows up in the relatively chronological narrative that Now offers, she actually has mentioned Jiko, and talked about how she wanted to make the diary a sort of biography of Jiko's life. By this point, it's become clear that that's probably not going to happen, and Now's going to carry on talking about her own life. But we, the reader, and Ruth of course, know that Now will eventually warm to Jiko. So there's this interesting layered dramatic irony, where Now, who's writing about her past, knows she'll grow to love Jiko and enjoy her time at the temple. Ruth knows this because of what Now said at the beginning of the diary, and the reader knows it too, because, again, of what Now said at the beginning of her diary. At the temple, Now learns a lot from her great-grandmother, including meditation techniques that will help her deal with her issues and feel more at peace. While at the temple, we're introduced to another character called Haruki No. 1, a young man who was a Japanese kamikaze pilot during World War II, and Jiko's son, so Now's great uncle. Haruki No. 1 was killed just before the war ended, and we're not initially told how. Now reads letters that he wrote to his mother, Jiko, after he was conscripted, and it's clear that he very much does not want to fight or kill or be part of any war. The letters also revealed that Haruki No. 1's training was pretty brutal, and he was severely bullied, along with other conscripts. Haruki eventually comes to terms with the knowledge that he'll die, and how he'll die as a kamikaze pilot. Quick bit of history for those who are unfamiliar with the kamikaze program. Basically, it was a part of the Japanese Air Force during World War II which bombed Allied ships a little less conventionally than just dropping an unguided explosive. Kamikaze airmen would fly their planes straight into enemy vessels in a suicide attack, which would in theory be more effective than just dropping a bomb. Of course, you'd also lose a plane and a pilot in such an attack, so this tactic generally only became particularly prevalent during the end of the Second World War. It's obviously quite a horrible and fascinating subject that I might cover in a future video. Anyway, partly because of her connection to Haruki No. 1 because of their knowledge and contentness for their impending suicides, Now comes to really idolise Haruki No. 1, and, in a parallel to Ruth's fascination and obsession with her, Now wants to learn everything she can about Haruki No. 1, his life, and his death. Just like how Ruth tries to find out everything she can about Now, Now's working with a lot less information about Haruki No. 1, and these characters having this intense fascination with the characters they're trying to learn more about heightens the reader's interest in Haruki No. 1. Like the reader, Ruth also yearns to learn more about Haruki No. 1 as Now does, which just adds to it. And then, Now gets this incredibly unique opportunity to do so. While she's staying at the temple, Jiko and the rest of the residents start preparing for a Buddhist festival called Obon, where the spirits come from their world to visit those still in the land of the living. Now's really excited about this prospect and really wants to meet some of her ancestors. One night, just before the festival begins, she sees a spirit who she initially believes is her father, who she thinks has killed himself. She eventually works out it's actually Haruki number 1 and introduces herself to him. He remarks how he didn't know he had a great niece, and then a minute or two later, he's gone. Nao is really annoyed at herself for boring Haruki number 1 so much that he left, but we'll leave that part of the story there for a second. I want to talk about a topic that comes up quite a lot in the novel: suicide. As I mentioned in the beginning, Nao is clearly having suicidal thoughts, and if any of the readers missed that, Ruth points it out in her chapter afterwards. But suicide isn't just prevalent to Nao's character. The reason she is pulled from California in the USA where she grew up is because her father, also called Haruki, lost his job. He was a software programmer but had to relocate back to Japan when he couldn't find any more employment, and even back in his home country he struggles desperately to find work. Nao blames quite a lot of her troubles on her father. He was the reason she had to go away from her life in the USA and back to Japan, where she is horrifically bullied and treated like an outsider. Naturally, because her father failed to find a job, Nao's family struggles to even survive in Japan. Initially, Haruki number 2, Nao's father, tells his family that he has found a job, but after a period of time, it is discovered that he lied, and after Nao's mother confronts him about it, he runs away, gets drunk, and, feeling like a failure, attempts suicide. To have any authority figure, especially a parent, in a bad emotional state can often be hard for a child, even of Nao's 16 years, to deal with. But to have her father attempt to kill himself is unfathomably tough, especially as he's pretty much all Nao has in Japan. She has nothing even close to a friend at school, and her mother acts distant under the stress of what's happening to their family. In fact, after the suicide, they all kind of pretend that it was an accident and that it didn't happen. Nao still knows it did happen and isn't really able to properly deal with it. She looks down at her father even more. That's partly why the other Haruki in this story is called Haruki number 1. He came first, but also in Nao's eyes, he is the superior Haruki. Also, she does see parallels between them, especially when it comes to suicide. In fact, Haruki number 1 seemingly coming to terms with his own inevitable death actually inspires Nao to want to kill herself. She sees it as a courageous acceptance of death, despite it being a self-inflicted one. In the letters that Haruki number 1 wrote to his mother Jiko, he says that he volunteered to become a kamikaze pilot because he wanted to have control over his death. Nao sees this as resolute, determined strength, even in the face of such horror, and compares Haruki number 1 to her father, who she thinks is such a failure he can't even successfully kill himself. Along with the idea of suicide running strong throughout the novel, there's another build-up that I'd like to draw attention to. As I mentioned before, it's clear that Haruki number 1's time in training was horribly brutal. He was severely bullied, and the novel does a really good job of surrounding what little you know of his time in the armed forces in this aura of dread. How isolated he clearly feels is another reason why Nao feels a connection to Haruki number 1. She too was bullied and feels incredibly alone in her life at school and at home. Haruki number 1, while clearly finding it horrible, still seems to retain his spirit and face it with courage. Also, Haruki number 1 is a kamikaze pilot, which is in itself this ridiculously horrible notion of an already horrible idea. It represents a terrible combination of honour, duty and suicide that stood as an almost integral part of Japanese culture, and that's something that still sticks around today. So with all this knowledge about how horrible Haruki number 1's training was, and suicide being such a prevalent topic that had already caused so much pain and suffering in the novel, let's move on to this impactful line. At one point during the Obon festival, the temple receives several visitors and what is clearly an important part of the festival, which Nao takes part in. Afterwards, she goes to Jiko's study and sees Jiko and another kneeling at an altar with their eyes closed. Just as she's about to leave, she hears someone suddenly enter the room behind her. The first thing they taught us was how to kill ourselves. After all this build-up to wondering what exactly Haruki number 1 went through, and after how prevalent suicide has been so far in the novel, this line really hits you. I definitely haven't done it any kind of justice here, but it really is an incredibly impactful moment. I mean, the idea of it is so perverse and antithetic, even within the perversity of war. That's how messed up the Japanese armed forces and general military ethos was. That's the training regime that the kind-hearted boy who loved philosophy and didn't want to kill anyone had to go through. As Haruki himself says, they were soldiers, but before they were taught to kill their enemies, they were taught to kill themselves. That's apparently the most important and urgent thing they have to learn. And think what this means to Nao as well. After beating herself up about not properly talking to him last time and wondering so much about his life, he appears to speak to her. Remember the suicidal parallels these two characters share too. Haruki is being forced to kill himself, and during his training just accepts that and waits for it, and now has decided she's going to kill herself, and is also waiting what she wants to be the few remaining days of her life away. In fact, this moment makes Now idolise Haruki number 1 even more, and drives her even closer to suicide. But Now doesn't quite get it, because Haruki number 1 doesn't really want to die, and so we're seeing this incredibly stark dichotomy between the two of them, and their outlooks on life, despite their similarities in how they think it's going to end. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there, because I don't want to make this video ridiculously long, and I think I've talked about the moment I enjoyed so much enough. I haven't really covered a sizable proportion of what this book is about at all, to be honest. It also delves into identity, time, morality, escapism, abuse, and much more. It'd feel weird to recommend it after talking about the plot so much, so I won't, but I'll just say that it was a really enjoyable read, and what I have talked about has been simplified so much it hasn't really done it justice. This video is actually an adaptation on a presentation I once did, so let me know below if you enjoyed it and if you'd like to see more stuff like this in the future. Of course, I imagine if you didn't enjoy it, you're probably not still watching, so I'll get a slightly skewed group of responses, but hey. Next week's video will be slightly different, and it'll be released on a Saturday too. I might accompany it with a 1-minute history video on the Sunday, but we'll see. If not, then I won't be speaking to you guys again until after I come back from filming in South Africa with Ben. So I wish you all the very best end of the summer, and best of luck to anyone starting a new academic year, or just coming back from their summer holidays in September. I'll see you then.